the Royal Society of Arts and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. His research involves using methods for corpus linguistics to carry out discourse analysis, and he has carried out studies looking at language use in a range of contexts, including violent jihadist propaganda, patient feedback, and newspaper representations of Muslim refugees and gay men. Professor Baker has published very extensively, and I want to make a special mention of his three most recent books. So the first one that has just come out, 2021, entitled Outrageous, the story of Section 28 in Britain's battle for LGBT education, published by Reaction London. Then another one from last year, 2021, co-authored by Gavin Brooks, entitled Obesity in the News, Language and Representation in the Press, published by Cambridge University Press. And the third one, entitled The Language of Violent Jihad, also published by Cambridge University Press, came out in 2021 as well, and has been co-authored by Rochelle Vesey and Tony McAnery. Professor Baker is commissioning editor of the journal Corpora, published by Edinburgh University Press. He's also on the editorial board for a number of journals, and I'm just going to name them. The Journal of English Linguistics, the Journal of Language and Sexuality, Gender and Language, Applied Linguistics, Journalism, Discourse Studies, and Text and Talk. He's a principal investigator of the project titled Improving Patient Experience, Textual Analysis of the National Cancer Patient Survey. And some of you may remember that Professor Baker visited us at the Faculty of English back in 2014 on the occasion of the Young Linguist Meeting Conference that I had the pleasure of co-organizing. He was one of our plenary speakers and delivered a lecture, again, just to refresh our memory, Mars and Venus Reappraised, exploring the idea of gender legs in the British national corpus. So we are delighted that Professor Baker is somehow back, although in this sort of virtual scenario. And today he will talk on corpus analysis or close reading, a case study on press representations of obesity. And before I give the virtual floor to Professor Baker, I just have one technical piece of information. If you'd like to share your comments or ask questions during the presentations, please type them in the chat, and then also you'll have a chance to voice your questions at the end of the presentations, okay? So thanks for being here, and again, over to Professor Baker. So the virtual floor is yours, Paul.
Thank you very much, Joanna. That's a really nice introduction. I don't know if you want to start recording now, or is it already recording? I'm not sure.
I have, but by other means, not Zoom internal.
That's great. Okay. Normally there's a little announcement to warn people. So I'm going to share my screen to begin with, I think. Now I hope you can all see that. Okay.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, so it is nice to be sort of back virtually in Poznan, even if it is just via a screen. I do have some very happy memories of that 2014 conference as well. I was just talking about it the other day to a friend. So this is a talk which is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of focus, because I'm talking about methodology, or the justification for using a particular research method, or set of methods in this case. I'm going to illustrate this with a case study involving representations of obesity in just one newspaper, the Daily Mail. So there's actually two sets of findings. There's one set of findings which is about what I found when I looked at the Daily Mail about obesity, and then there's another set of findings relating to the methods and combining them and what was the best way to go about that. Hopefully this will make more sense as we go along. So the methodology part forms part of an ongoing strand of my research where I've tried to combine corpus techniques with those from critical discourse analysis. And to this end, I've contributed to a series of studies which have examined the value of triangulating corpus methods with other approaches. So this talk isn't about whether or not triangulating is a good idea. I think I've talked about that elsewhere. But instead, I want to focus on a more practical question that if we decide we're going to do some form of triangulation, combining the corpus approach with maybe looking at small samples of data more qualitatively from the corpus. The question is, what sort of combination of the corpus approach and the samples do we actually use? How do we decide which samples to actually use? So the case study I'm going to talk about was actually a pilot study for the larger research project, which I worked on my research centre, which is Corpus Approaches to Social Science Research. That's at Lancaster, and I worked on this with Gavin Brooks, and Joanna just mentioned the monograph of CUP, which kind of came out as a result of that last year. So this was actually a pilot study to that project. And our question was, how is obesity represented in the Daily Mail, which was just one newspaper that we looked at. For the full project, we actually compiled corpus of 10 newspapers over a 10-year period. But for this pilot study, we're just looking at one newspaper from a 5-year period. And to analyse the corpus, I've used fairly standard corpus linguistics methods. I've looked at collocates of words like obese and obesity, and then looked at concordance lines to see how the representations occur within those lines. And I'm going to combine that with a more qualitative analysis, a kind of close reading of articles. And what I thought I'd do is collect 10 articles, samples of 10, and then sort of read them to a kind of qualitative line-by-line analysis of those. And I've done this 4 times, so I've got 4 different sets of 10 articles. And what I thought I could then do is compare the findings I got from these 4 sets of articles to see whether I found different things in them or the same thing, and then compare that also to the corpus analysis to see whether or not I'm finding, again, different things or the same thing there. That means I want to make lots of decisions. How do I collect samples from a large data set? And does it matter how many texts are in the sample, for example? Will that change the results? Are some methods of sampling better than others? Maybe some methods are better at answering certain research questions and some are better at answering other research questions. So I've kind of got 5 conditions here. I've got my corpus analysis, and then I've got my 4 different samples, which are all collected in different ways. So once I'd actually done the analysis, I've kind of done a meta-analysis where I've compared all the findings I get from these different data sets, and then kind of trying to reflect on the process, thinking about best practice. So before I get to all that, I'll talk a little bit about the context of the study on obesity. And obesity has been quite a hot topic in the press for quite some time. It's not really showing any signs of going away. In the larger data set, the larger corpus of 10 newspapers that I looked at, there are 6,900 mentions of obesity in 2008. And then on the last year of collection, 2017, it's gone up to 14,000, so it's more than doubled. The National Health Service has claimed that obesity can shorten lifespan by up to 14 years, and it can also impact on quality of people's lives in numerous ways, in terms of self-esteem, for example, which is strongly linked to attitudes and perceptions, and also media language as well. Now, earlier research on reporting on obesity has found the reporting to be quite alarmist and argued to be a function of social control. And over time, there's been found to be a shift from a kind of deterministic view, where things like genes are seen as responsible for obesity, to a more kind of personal responsibility view of obesity. So it's kind of your own fault if you're obese because of the choices you made around your diet or exercise. And we found that, particularly in tabloids compared to broadsheets, we're seeing this kind of personal responsibility frame of obesity, whereas the broadsheets tend to focus more on more structural issues like the presence of food advertising or social inequality or government policy. I've chosen to look at the Daily Mail. It's the most popular newspaper in the UK if you take into account online views as well as paper views. It's also viewed as the most right-wing newspaper in the UK, according to a 2017 study. I picked it for the pilot study because I thought it's got quite a lot of influence in the UK. It's also likely to maybe have quite strong points of views in relationship to other newspapers. So I thought it would be useful to kind of use it as maybe a benchmark or a starting place to get a sense of what's possible in the data. And I kind of hypothesized that I'd find maybe quite negative representations involving a lot of blaming and shaming of individuals, but I'm also going to try and keep an open mind and look for kind of counter examples to that as well. So for data collection, I used an online press archive called Nexus, which our university subscribes to collect the articles. I collected articles. They had to contain the words obese and obesity. They had to be in the Daily Mail, and they had to occur from 2012 to 2016. And that gave me quite a smallish corpus, really, for a news corpus. 1,201 articles, about 1 million words in size, which is about a good size to use a tool like Anticonquer or Wordsmith to analyze. If I'm using a larger data set, I'd probably use something like Sketch Engine, which is a lot more powerful. Now, generally, when I've been involved in these kinds of studies where you use different methods to analyze things, I've often worked with other people, and we've all sort of worked independently, and one of us has maybe used a qualitative approach, and somebody else has used maybe a corpus approach, and then we go off separately, we do that, then we come back together at the end, and we kind of compare our notes. And for this study, I thought I'd take a different approach, and I thought it may be interesting to kind of try to control for different analysts' biases. So I thought I'd do all the analysis myself, but that also raises a lot of other potential issues. There's a problem of analytical pollination, where the issue is if I look at the first data set and find something, by the time I get to the next data set, I'm kind of thinking about what I found in the first data set, and maybe that's priming me to look for the same things in the second data set, and so on. You can't kind of wipe your memory and start fresh each time you look at a new data set. So you're always going to have this kind of effect of looking at the older data when you look at the second set. Another issue is analyst fatigue. So by the time I may get to the last data set, I may be less alert, less motivated, just want to get it finished. So I don't do a good as job as I did maybe at the beginning. So to try to take these issues into account, I did the analysis of the samples 3 times each, and I kind of waited a week between each set of analyses. Of course, this means there was pollination still, but at least it was reasonably equal across the data sets, and the gaps between the stage of analysis meant that I was less likely to get fatigued and start to miss things. I also tried to spend the same amount of time on each of the samples, so none got more time than the others. I don't think that the way I did it is necessarily the best way or the only way, and I can't say that it provides definite generalizable results. It would be interesting to run the process again, maybe using different settings or different variables there. I started with a quite a broad research question, which was just how was obesity represented in the Daily Mail between these 2 years? Over the course of the analysis, though, particularly during the first kind of set of analyses that I did, newer research, more detailed research questions emerged, and so that was quite helpful for then narrowing the focus. And then when I did the second set and the third set, I could answer these additional research questions. So these are the kind of more detailed research questions that I came up during the early stages during the analysis. So I'm looking at what social actors are represented as obese, how are they evaluated, what is seen as the consequences of obesity, what are seen as the causes of obesity, and what actions are suggested to reduce obesity, and finally, what strategies are used to legitimate the positions taken in response to the above questions by journalists. So the next step is to describe how I actually did the sampling. How do you select just a few articles, 10 articles, if you have 1,200 to choose? And I did this 4 ways, as I mentioned earlier. So here's the first way. I thought maybe I'll just collect articles which refer to the topic of obesity the most. So some articles can be quite long, but maybe they only mention obesity once. Some may be quite short, but mention it an awful lot, having it as the main focus of their story. So I thought the more you mention an article, the richer the data set's going to be, and maybe that's going to give you more findings. So very simply, I just counted up the number of times each article mentioned the words obesity, and then I just took the top 10 from that list, and then I chose those as the ones to look at for my kind of set 1. I used Anticonquer to do this. It's got quite a nice word distribution tool, so you can run that across the files, and it shows the articles that have the most mentions of a word or a set of words. Now, of course, one consequence of taking the articles with the most mentions is that maybe there's going to be a correlation with longer articles having the most mentions, and that did actually prove to be the case. So the average length of these 10 articles is 1,071 words. but the average length of the articles across the whole of this million-word corpus is actually 833 words, so it is about 200 words bigger. Not hugely bigger, but we can't say this is a representative set necessarily. For the second set, I tried to find articles which are most typical of the whole corpus, as opposed to the ones which are just have the most mentions of obesity. So to find the most typical articles, I used a tool which I helped Lawrence Anthony to create in 2015, which is called Protant. You can open down this yourself if you want to have a play with it online if you do a Google search for the name of it. So what this tool does is it takes all the text in your corpus and looks at them, and it counts up the number of keywords in each text, and then it sort of orders the text in relationship to the ones that have the proportion, so the most keywords, they come at the top of the list. And you have to specify your own reference corpus in order to get the keywords in the first place. For this particular study, I used something called BE06, which is a reference corpus I made myself. And it's contained 1 million words of written, published English from 2006. Now, as with any study using keywords, the reference corpus that you use is going to impact on the keywords you get, but I felt that BE06 was a reasonably good reference corpus to identify the kind of keywords that are going to be useful for this study. Now, another issue with using Protant, if you do decide to use it yourself, is that it's designed to work on texts that are the same length. If you use texts that are of different lengths, you kind of get slightly odd results with the smaller text kind of coming to the top of the list. Now, Lawrence, who wrote the code for this, is aware of this kind of issue. He hasn't incorporated a fix yet, so I had to do the fix myself by hand using a kind of logarithmic smoothing algorithm, which I just mentioned there. I had to sort of put everything into Excel and do that by hand. No, it's not essential that you understand how it works, but if you ever do decide you want to use Protant and you're using different sized texts, send me an email and I'll send you the instructions on how to get that done. Okay, so this slide shows the headlines for the 10 articles that I got using this Protant methodology to get the most kind of typical articles, the ones that have the most keywords in. And you can see here, there's lots of references to health issues, things like dementia and diabetes and heart attacks, a lot of reference to women and also to babies as well. Now, the third approach, to get the third set, I thought I'll think about fluctuating patterns of media interest, because sometimes the media can get very excited in a story for a short time, and then they can drop it and don't talk about it for ages, and then it comes back again, that sort of thing. So I thought I'd look at the point in time when there was the most interest in the Daily Mail in obesity, and then I'll take articles from that particular month. So the reasoning here is that a sort of spike may show a kind of heightened period of intense focus, kind of build-up, which may offer an interesting aspect of representation. So I got 5 years, and I took articles from the month with the most articles. If you can see there, it's the article towards the end, May 2015, which had 39 articles in it. So I just took 10 articles from that month and spread equally across the month. Now, you may wonder why was May 2015 kind of a high spot for talking about obesity? I couldn't actually find a particular, kind of focus, around a particular topic or person to explain this. But what I did find when I looked more generally at the larger corpus study, which was over 10 years, that it was almost always May, which had the most articles. So it seems to be a kind of seasonal thing where the Daily Mail decides that May, and not just the Daily Mail, but all the other newspapers too, decide that May is a really interesting point when they're going to mention obesity. And when you look at detail, it's often about articles relating to people's summer holidays that are coming up in July and August, and articles about particularly women who are concerned about whether they'll be able to look nice in their bikinis when they go on holiday and go swimming by the pool. And so they're kind of very anxious about this. And so in May, there's articles about dieting and kind of addressing these concerns. And that seems to happen every single year. And finally, for the last set, I used a random number generator using Google. So I just got it to pick 10 articles at random. So the first 3 ways kind of similar in that they all involve some kind of principled, replicable methods of sampling. I could tell you what the method was, you could go away and do it, and you get the same results as me. But set 4 is a random set, and if I told you how to do it, you would get different numbers if you used Google to me, so you would get a different set of random articles that I would. So that's worth bearing in mind. Okay, so thinking about, I have my 10 sets now, what do I actually do with them? Sorry, my 4 sets, not my 10 sets. So for the close reading, I did various things. I considered patterns around quotation or other forms of intertextuality. So I looked at who gets quoted, how much space they're given when they're quoted, and whereabouts in the article do they get quoted. So often, if someone's quoted at the front of the article, at the start, and they get a lot of space, that kind of implies that they're given precedence and their views are maybe seen as more important than maybe somebody who gets half a sentence at the end of the article. I also tried to see whether or not the article itself kind of oriented to the quote and sort of evaluated it in some way, or agreed or disagreed with it. So quotations often used as a kind of legitimation strategy in different ways to justify maybe the newspaper's position on a topic, and I'll show some examples of that a bit later. I also looked at lexical choice. So how do articles refer to people who are obese? Do they use a noun, such as the obese, to reduce them to a single quality? Or do they use quite an offensive or colloquial term like fatties to talk about them? Do they use adjectives to describe them? Words like porky, for example, which I found in the corpus. So nouns, adjectives. I also looked at verbs. So I looked at specifically what actions people are described as doing, who is doing the action, who is having the action done to them as well, and what is being described as being done to people. I also considered metaphors, which are often memorable and evocative ways of representing people and situations. So metaphors represent something in terms of what it's not, and they create associations that can have strong attitudinal effects. So, referring to obesity as a time bomb frames it as an explosive and dangerous and scary situation. I also tried to look at implicatures. So, for example, in one article, I found there was an article giving a review of a television program, and it referred to one of the characters in the program as the boat's grossly obese and scarily violent owner. And I thought there was maybe a bit of linking of the two traits here. We shouldn't be surprised that someone who's grossly obese is also scarily violent, for example. I also tried to think about cases of inconsistencies or absences. So do articles disagree with each other or themselves in some way? Is there something that could have been mentioned but wasn't mentioned? Things like that. In terms of quoting patterns, are certain types of people given a voice at the expense of other people? So I'm not going to follow a particular or specific framework. There are lots out there, but what I've done, if you know about CDS, you'll probably have recognised a lot of what I've just said from people like Norman Fairclough, Tone van Leeuwen, Riesikel and Wodak as well, for example, who talked about the above phenomena quite a lot. So I'm kind of combining all the things that they've done. Here's an example of just one of the articles and how some of these aspects of analysis come in here. So this is one called Beware, if you've pound on the pounds, you may never lose them again. It's quite a long article and it kind of runs over 2 pages. So this is just the first page. And I've put in bold the first paragraph. You can see how it's very much framed around quoting from scientists who are described as British researchers, and then later on in that paragraph they're described as experts. And this was quite common. A lot of Mail articles did report on studies carried out on obesity, revealing about who is obese, how many people are obese, and how people become obese. I think the last sentence of that first paragraph is slightly odd. The findings are a stark warning of the lasting consequences of putting on weight, experts said last night. I think that the plural experts there is a bit strange. It kind of brings to mind, kind of a kind of row of experts also kind of saying the same thing at the same time, which is clearly not the case. And it's more, the Mail is kind of possibly summarising, kind of what maybe several people have said, and kind of, it's kind of maybe a bit difficult. I know myself, when I've been quoted the newspapers, I sometimes read it and think, I didn't actually say that. I wish they'd actually put quotes in and quoted me directly. So I'm always a bit wary when you get kind of this kind of paraphrasing in newspapers, particularly when it's of several people at once. Another aspect of this kind of research-based study that's mentioned is the use of quantification, which is very strong in this article. And I just put those quantities there in bold. You can see they kind of run through every paragraph there. You know, it's hard to argue with numbers. So there's a very kind of strong kind of legitimation going on when you kind of quote lots of numbers at people. And here's the second half of the article. And I've just put in bold print a quote from someone who's not a scientist, but he's been contacted by the Mail to provide an opinion on the research, which is being reported on. So he does this afterwards. And he's a man called Tam Fry. He's a spokesperson of the National Obesity Forum. Now, he comes up quite a lot in this corpus of 1 million words. He's mentioned in 83 different articles. That's 7% of the articles in the corpus get his mention. So he's often asked to he's often called upon by the Mail to give an opinion. And it's quite a long opinion here. It's a whole paragraph. It's 126 words of the article. And they tend to report what he says without any kind of criticism at all. Although we found when we looked at the larger corpus, other newspapers are often quite critical of what Tam Fry has to say. They say that he gives out bad advice, but the Mail tends not to ever say that. And Tam Fry does have quite a kind of direct way of saying things. So here he says, prevention is the key. It's been for years with messages aimed at people to not get fat in the first place, but an increasing number don't listen. Very much a kind of personal responsibility argument being used here. You're obese because you don't listen. I thought the wording at the start of that paragraph is quite interesting too. He says, it's the devil's own job to get the obese person down to size. And that phrasing, the obese person, sounds a bit, I don't know, detached and almost as if he's talking about obese people like they're a specimen or something. So there's kind of a distancing process going on there with that language. Another analytical point I wanted to mention, just lastly, is quite towards the end of the article where they talk about a second study right at the end. And this is one that kind of blames grandparents for children becoming obese. It's saying that grandparents are giving sugary sweets and snacks to children, and they don't let them carry out physical chores. And I thought the word let there was really interesting. Normally let is used to refer to things that people want to do. So, I can imagine a grandparent saying something like, if you're good, I'll let you stay up late and we can watch a film together, and things like that. You don't usually use let about carrying out physical chores. Chores are something you don't want to do. In fact, the word chore has a more general meaning. You say, oh, it's such a chore to do this. It's something we don't enjoy. So if grandparents don't let children carry out chores, that seems like a strange wording. If I was writing a sentence, I'd have said, we don't make them carry out physical chores, because generally you have to make people do chores, especially when they're children. I can know that from babysitting my nephews and nieces. So I think let's a really interesting word choice here, and it kind of emphasises that, the sense that grandparents are to blame for this. So this article has some kind of quite scientific discourse to it, but there's also a personal responsibility discourse coming in as well. Okay, so I'll mention now how I did the corpus analysis. So this was based on collocates, and I basically just took two words, the search terms, obese and obesity, put the corpus into ANCONC, and then got collocates of these words. If you're interested in the collocational settings that I used a span of 5 words either side of obese or obesity. The collocates had to have a mutual information score of at least 6 and a T-score of at least 2. So I'm kind of combining a strength-based measure and a kind of hypothesis testing measure there. And also I gave a kind of mean frequency of 5 for the collocate to appear as well. And these two tables show the top 50 collocates that have the highest MI scores for each word. And I've categorized these by hand into kind of semantic/thematic categories. This was done by carrying out quite quick concordances on the words, not really constituting an analysis in itself. The concordances were just really a kind of preliminary step, just so I could get a sense of how the words were used in context, so that would help me to put them into categories. And then later I did a much more detailed concordance analysis of some of the words. In an ideal world, I would have looked at all 100 words on this page in detail, doing concordance analyses. I was finding that was going to take an awful long time, much longer than it would have been when I was doing the analysis of the sets of the actual articles. And I didn't want it to be an unfair comparison. So I thought, if I was spending, half an hour looking at a set of articles, I should also spend half an hour reading on the corpus analysis too, just to make it a fair comparison. So to do this, I thought, I can't look at all 100 words. What I'll do is maybe pick words from different categories that would give me maybe a kind of different perspectives and a kind of representative set of words to consider the most coverage of the collocates. So I put the words that I've looked at in bold here. 5 for the first category and 5 for the second table, sorry. I've got grossly, branded, proportion, Britons, epidemic, forum, spiraling, tackle, and blamed. So I've tried to say one word from each category, and I try to focus on the categories that have the most words in them as well. So with these collocates, I've done a concordance analysis of how they work as collocates. In many cases, I looked at concordances and had to expand the concordance lines to a full paragraph or even the full text to get a sense of who's been quoted or what the authorial stance of the article is. Here's an example of some of the collocates of grossly, which collocates with obese. So it's a sense of reading kind of sentences, expanding concordance line, trying to get a sense of what patterns of representation are in here. Quite negative ones. Around people who are described as grossly obese. The first one I've mentioned already about the boat owner who's scarily violent. The second one's interesting. It's about relatives who are, kind of being blamed for childhood obesity, and parents are described as grossly obese themselves, and they let children guzzle sugar-laden fizzy drinks and gorge themselves on fatty takeaways. And I thought these verbs like guzzle and gorge are quite interesting words. They paint a very strongly negative picture of how these children eat, implying greed. And I think there's also a kind of sense of disgust that's been conveyed in this article as well. And the parents are seen as hypocritically whinging about skills in supermarkets rather than looking at their own behaviour, which again is this sort of personal responsibility stance. Okay, so that's kind of how I did analysis, and I'll also show you a slide where I'm going to show you the findings that I got from this, and I tried to summarise this just in one slide, so it's a bit overwhelming, so I apologise for this in advance. Here it is. It's kind of a table which shows all the findings that I've got and which of the different types of analysis yielded those findings. So I put those as a tick. So, for example, looking at the top of the table, I've got my first research question, who are the types of people who are affected by obesity? And I actually found that there were 3 types of people. Children were mentioned an awful lot, women were mentioned an awful lot, and particularly pregnant women and babies were mentioned a lot too. These were the 3 main groups that came up again and again. And so I put a tick to show, did this particular form of analysis that I used find that particular finding? So with set 1, the samples, which was the ones that had the most mentions of obesity, these were quite long articles, they did find that there was a focus on children. In fact, every single condition I used found that there was a focus on children, but only set 2 and set 3 found that there was a focus on women, and only sets 2, 3, and the corpus approach, which I call that set 5, found the focus on pregnant women, and so on. So we can sort of look down this admittedly complicated table, and I'm not going to go through all of those findings and explain what each one meant. It would take far too long, and that's not really the focus of the talk. But I'm more interested in which approaches found which kinds of answers to which research questions. And I kind of highlighted where this happens here. So finding for research question 1, the types of people affected by obesity, it's set 2 and set 3, which tend to do best here. For looking at representations of obese people, the corpus approach actually did the best there. That tended to pick up the different representations of obese people. For looking at the consequences of obesity, it was set 2, which was the the set of articles that had the most keywords in. That tended to be the best doing that. But looking at causes of obesity, it tended to be set 1, which did better, which was the set which had the most mentions of obesity, the long articles. And then for the legitimation strategies, it was actually set 4, which was actually the random sample, and that actually gave me more of these legitimation strategies. So quite interestingly here, every kind of method that I used did quite well at answering a particular type of research question. So that's something that I wasn't expecting to find, a kind of interesting kind of outcome of this kind of comparison of studies. So each method maybe has different strengths. I also thought I'd compare the results across each other. So in that table, I have 22 rows, 22 findings in total. The Corpus approach actually got the most. We got 14 findings. The one that got the least was set 3, which is articles from the month of May, the same month, that only got 11 findings. But there's not a huge amount of difference between 11 and 14, to be fair. Now, there were 5 findings that I got no matter what I did. So these were the idea of children being at risk, the idea of obesity being bad because it's strange to the National Health Service, the idea that food manufacturers are sort of partly responsible for obesity, the use of expert opinions of researchers and scientists and legitimate views, and also the idea that obesity is a problem which is getting worse. No matter what sample I looked at, or whether I did the Corpus analysis, those 5 findings came up all the time. And it suggests that they're reasonably common. No matter where you look, you're going to get those things. So they're kind of littered throughout the Daily Mail's corpus of obesity. And maybe they're the most typical things in there. Now, 3 of the approaches, though, found something unique that none of the other approaches found. So the Corpus approach found that obese people were being used as a justification in another kind of argument. The random sample found that some negative representations were kind of legitimated by the author because the author described himself as being obese. So they were kind of saying, well, I'm obese and I find myself disgusting, isn't it awful? And that was kind of a legitimation strategy to say horrible things about obese people because the author themselves had kind of said they were obese too. And the sample, which was based on the most keywords, actually found a sort of oppositional view that actually maybe obese is actually quite good for you, which was very different from all the other articles that I found. So these maybe point to more rare cases. It's good that I found them, but they're not maybe typical of what's happening. I was also interested in which of the different sets kind of agreed and found the same kind of findings. So I did a kind of sort of inter comparison here, comparing each set against each other set and also using the Corpus approach as well. So I've got the percentage here, findings that are kind of the same between each set. And you can see that the set which had the most similar findings is the set which had the most frequent mentions of obesity and the random set. And that they actually had 63% similar findings. And the one that had the least amount of findings was the random set and the set which used the most keywords. Now, here I think actually having low numbers would be better than having high numbers because we don't necessarily want to just repeat our findings and repeat our analysis unless we're really trying to prove that something does exist. But if you have 2 sets of data and they actually give you different things, I think that's actually quite helpful because you're getting more results and you're looking at more of the corpus. So I'd actually say that 32% is maybe a good way if you wanted to take 2 sets of articles. One way would be to take a random set, maybe one way would be to take a set based on keywords. But bear in mind that the random set would be different each time, so this may not be replicated if I did it again with a different random set. How about if this is just a version which compares two sets together, but what if we had a 3rd set in or a 4th set? Is it actually worth looking at more than 2 sets? Is there added value in looking at extra sets, or are we basically just not finding that much more? So this table sort of shows what happens, how many findings we get if we look at just 2 sets, or 1 set, or 3 or 4. So with one set, I found between 11 and 14 things. If I then go to looking at two sets, the most I'm going to get is 19, and the least I'm going to get is 50. If I look at three sets, I'm going to get between 18 and 21 findings, and then four sets, I'm going to get between 21 and 22. So there's kind of diminishing returns, I think, from adding on new sets of data, I think possibly the biggest kind of gain is maybe from going from one set to two sets, and you do get quite a big sort of gain there. Putting on three sets doesn't really give you that much more. So I think there definitely does seem to be some value maybe in combining, an analysis, maybe one chooses the corpus analysis versus one that chooses maybe a qualitative analysis, maybe of one or two samples. Maybe, a sample which actually contains the most mention of the search term would be a good way forward. So a couple of kind of summarizing slides before I finish talking. This is what I found out about the Daily Mail in the study. So I'd expected to find more cases around personal responsibility and shaming. And I thought the Mail would be actually quite defensive of big business decisions that other people have blamed for obesity. I also thought that during this period that I wouldn't find the Mail being kind of critical of the government, which was a conservative government. I thought I'd find a lot of blaming of the individual, and a lot maybe of fat shaming or a ridiculing of people as well. And I did find this, but not as much maybe as I was expected to find. And what I found instead is that the Mail seemed to have lots of different stances on obesity. Sometimes it blames food manufacturers and advertisers, sometimes government policy, sometimes genes or bacteria, sometimes political correctness, sometimes the European Union, sometimes individuals. So it just seemed to sort of have a kind of bag of blame, and it kind of threw it everywhere. And sometimes you found lots of different kind of people being blamed or organisations being blamed in the same article. So by the end of this, I didn't really understand what the Mail thought about obesity, who it thought it was to blame. It just seemed to have no consistent stance. Now maybe that's good, maybe that's balanced reporting, it's giving lots of perspectives. It could maybe be a result of shifting or incoherent editorial policy on behalf of the Mail. Perhaps more cynically, it could be seen maybe that the Mail is deliberately complicating things, so it becomes difficult then to focus blame on a particular target like the government. But then if someone says, well, the Mail doesn't blame the government, the Mail will say, well, we do blame the government, in these articles, but then because there's so many other people who get blamed, that kind of gets lost in the kind of the mix. So interesting findings, but not exactly what I was expecting to find, which is good in a way. Okay, this slide evaluates what happened when I used the Corpus method of analysis. So I found that using collocate was good to give me a sense of the surface evaluation and the kind of generally negative representations around obese people. It allowed me to identify the most frequent patterns in the corpus as well. So seeing that the word obesity collocates with words like epidemic, time bomb, crisis, and tired and grip 234 times tells me that that is a very frequent representation of obesity as getting out of control and as a bad thing. Some of the collocates helped me to identify less common cases. So grossly, there's a collocate of obese only occurred 7 times, and I was expecting it to more cases like this. So it helped me to maybe reduce my own biases. If something only happens 7 times, it's not that common, but I was expecting to see a lot more of that. I did find that I had to use concordancing a lot to get a more nuanced sense of how a collocate was being used, and also to see sometimes that a collocate had multiple functions. So a collocate like blamed sometimes occurs when a person is being blamed for obesity, but that's actually less common than I was expecting. And what blamed was tended to be more used for was when obesity is being blamed for something else. So obesity is blamed for, say, people snoring. And I wasn't expecting, again, to find that. Initially, when I just saw the word blamed, I just thought it was going to be people being blamed for things. I will mention again, I want to keep the analysis equal, in terms of amount of time spent on it. So I only looked at 10 collocates, not a definitive analysis. Somebody else could have come along, picked a different 10 collocates, probably found different things to me with maybe some overlap. So that's worth bearing in mind. For the samples, the close analysis of the text was good at addressing a wider range of research questions, looking at things like the legitimation strategies that were used, the causes of obesity, and the solutions that were proposed to obesity. I found that by considering who was being quoted and how much space they were given, I was able to get a much better sense of the newspaper's stance on obesity as opposed to just looking at a concordance line. And one surprise I got from this was that the approach of taking 10 articles at random turned out to be just as good as the other ones in terms of finding interesting things. Maybe that's just the luck of the draw, and if I did it again and got a different set of 10 articles, I wouldn't have found as interesting things. So that, I mentioned the random way of sampling is not replicable, and it does raise questions about random sampling versus the more principled sampling where you can replicate the conditions. So for example, the random sample contained 2 articles that were written by obese people who were then rude about obese people. So that's that legitimation strategy I mentioned. A very interesting finding, but maybe it's not that typical. And maybe if I'd taken another set of random articles, I wouldn't have found any cases of this. So again, this I think maybe gives us a good case for combining different approaches, maybe combining different ways of sampling. We can spot something in a sample, then we can maybe go to a corpus to see whether it's actually that frequent or not. So this is my last slide, and I wanted to reflect more here on the process of doing the analysis in terms of combining the samples with doing a corpus analysis. Now, I've tried to control for different factors to explain my findings, but if I'd made different choices, obviously, I think I would have made different findings, different amounts of findings. The number of collocates I looked at and the choices of collocates, clearly impacted on what I've obtained in the results. I should also mention it was all done from my own perspective, and if I'd included, different analysts and tried to do some kind of inter-rater comparison, I probably would have got different results as well. I think with these kind of comparative studies, there's never, a kind of definitive way of doing it or a best way that gives us the full story. But I think there's value in, trying different ways of doing these kind of multiple approaches, these triangulation studies. Sometimes combining different researchers, combining different approaches, different amounts of time, just to kind of build up a picture of, what does happen when we do triangulation. So this study is a kind of jigsaw piece in a bigger jigsaw puzzle. It's not the puzzle itself. It's not the full picture. And as I've noticed and noted earlier, adding further approaches results in diminishing returns, and possibly the number of unseen findings decreases as we do more and more analyses. It gets harder to spot new things. So the question is, do we want to find everything? Do we want to find the most important or the most frequent things or the main things in the data? If you do, then you don't need to keep doing more and more samples and analyses. But if you really want to find the rare things, there is more value in taking more and more sets. But then there's more work involved in that, so there is diminishing returns. So I would probably recommend to get the most out of this kind of approach. I do the corpus approach, and maybe 1 or 2 sets of samples would be recommended. Maybe the sample that had the most references to what you're looking at, or maybe the one that had the most keywords in. Maybe that would be useful. And I'd also say, it's kind of useful to kind of go between the different approaches, move back and forth between them. And it was only by doing this that I was able to kind of get a sense of these new research questions in the first place. And that led to a deeper form of analysis. And, I think actually developing research questions is one of the most important parts of doing an analysis. It's often the case that I find when I start off, I choose the wrong research questions, or research questions that I can't answer, or kind of give me a bit of a boring answer that probably people would have been able to, guess anyway. So I've always found that when you can start with a general research question, but it's only when you're doing the analysis at the start that newest research questions emerge, ones maybe you haven't thought of, and that lets you focus the analysis and maybe take it in more interesting and unexpected directions, which is useful. So I'd say the analysis shouldn't be just done in a kind of linear way, but it should be more circular, kind of going back over and switching between different methods and approaches. And that's a good way of getting the most out of this kind of analysis. So here are my references. I actually haven't included the reference to the book which came out last year. I forgot to do that, but Joanna mentioned it at the start. And so that's kind of the full kind of result of this pilot study, which was just the beginning of quite a long process. So I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you got something from that or you enjoyed it.